Welcome to the program Light from Above, sponsored by the Wadsworth, Ohio Church of Christ. My name is Andy Robison. I'm the director of the West Virginia School of Preaching and honored to be a guest speaker on this program. We would like to ask you to listen to this following song as a basis for the message that we'll preach in just a moment. It's about the resurrection of Christ and reasons I believe in it. The song is titled Reasons I Believe.
People often ask me, why do you believe? Why do you believe and follow Jesus? That is when I tell them the reasons I can give for knowing that my Savior with God in heaven lives. I believe that Jesus, who was crucified, just as the prophets prophesied, he left the tomb unoccupied with angels in his stead. And I believe he showed himself to witnesses, to those who would attest to his true presence in the midst of them, the many who beheld. So when the people ask me, why do you believe? Why do you believe and follow Jesus? That is when I tell them the reasons I can give for knowing that my Savior with God in heaven lives. I believe they preached him in Jerusalem as resurrected Son of Man, and enemies could not reprimand the truth of all their claims. And I believe disciples suffered sword and flame. They gladly bore the pain and shame to magnify the holy name of Christ their risen Lord. This one great fact of history I'll cling to all my days, that one day I may see him when with him I am raised. That one day I may see him when with him I am raised.
Hope you enjoyed the song. Thank you for listening. The opening stanza of the song presents a predicament that many preachers and Christians find themselves in from time to time. People often ask me, why do I believe? Why do I believe and follow Jesus? Well, there's good answer for that. It is not just about a blind leap of faith. There are things that we can know about Jesus of Nazareth, things that we can know about his existence, his life on the earth, and, yes, his death, burial, and even resurrection from the dead. I believe that Jesus Christ was resurrected from the dead, not because my parents told me, and not because somebody else told me, and not because it's something that I want to believe. I believe the evidence points us there. I've always been a person who wanted evidence, hard, solid evidence for the things that I've seen. Some people might not like this, but not all evidence comes in the form of a test tube. While I appreciate and admire scientists for their work, there are different kinds of evidence. There's circumstantial evidence, there's evidence that adds layers upon layers of reasons to believe in a particular thing, much like eyewitnesses are accountable for telling what happened at a car accident, and there might be some other scientific things that take place there that make a court case more provable in one direction or another. Well, that's the way it is with the resurrection of Christ. There are, I believe, at least 4 good reasons. At least in this song, I just present 4 good reasons to believe in the resurrection of Christ from the dead. Now, there is a lifetime of study that many people have put into this. I won't even begin to touch the hem of the garment with the reasons, but at least maybe we can get some sort of overview. The first reason that I'd like to present to you is something that is reflected in the very first verse of the song. I believe that Jesus, who was crucified, just as the prophets prophesied, left the tomb unoccupied with angels in his stead. Of course, that's a reference to the way the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, present that at the resurrection of Christ, his body was no longer in the tomb, but there were angels there telling those visitors, those witnesses, about what had happened. He is no longer here, but he is risen. I believe that this is really the case because Jesus is not some mythological character that people dreamed up. Now, I'm well aware that there are many mythological characters who had many similarities in their stories to what Jesus Christ of Nazareth finally had in his story. I'm well aware that there are many death, burial, and resurrection stories, some of which even incorporate a virgin birth and a triumphal entry. But I'm also convinced that none of those mythological stories had many of the markers that make Jesus' life different, many of the markers that make his resurrection different. And one of those main markers is the fact that Jesus' life, His death, His burial, and His resurrection were predicted hundreds and even thousands of years in advance. Let me try to explain. Some people will say, wait a minute, Robison, you're telling us that these things were predicted in the Old Testament and fulfilled in the New Testament, and I'd say that's correct. And they might say, wait a minute, we think somebody just made up that stuff and wrote it down in the Bible. Well, I would then at that point encourage some serious research and reflection, because we can prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that the Old Testament was written before 250 BC, 250 years before Christ. Now, I'm of the persuasion that it was completed 400 years before Christ, but we know that it was completed 250 years before Christ because at that time history records for us, secular history records for us, that the Septuagint was published from Alexandria, Egypt. The Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures. So those prophecies that refer to Christ from the book of Isaiah, from the book of Psalms, and from all through the Old Testament were done, written, circulated, published widely for people to see 250 years before Christ ever came. At least 250 years before Christ ever came. Then we have the New Testament documents, and some people will say, well, those are just late forgeries that were written to try and validate the beginnings of the Christian religion. Not so, I would counter. There's a lot of study that could be done in that area. For example, you might look up on the encyclopedia online or something, Sir William Ramsay, who was a British historian and archaeologist that set out in his life to disprove the book of Acts, the historical book of the early church. He wanted to disprove it. He wanted to say that it was wrong. But the more he researched, the more he found evidence that it was correct, and became not only a defender of the book of Acts, but a defender of the Christian religion, and a very voluminous scholar regarding the life of the Apostle Paul, who was converted after his experience on the road to Damascus, as recorded in Acts chapter 9, 22, and 26. Some people would say these New Testament documents, like the gospel accounts that we have in Acts and the letters after that, were really late 2nd, 3rd century forgeries. But they weren't. They weren't. There is documentary evidence to tell us otherwise. There's documentary evidence to tell us that we have what was written within 20, 30, 50, 60 years of the time of the life of Christ. And some of this documentary evidence goes, well, something like this. I get this from a chart in J.P. Moreland's book, Scaling the Secular City, published back in the 1980s. J.P. Moreland was a quite voluminous scholar regarding the resurrection of Christ, and he gives us this information regarding certain other documents that originated from about the same time period as the New Testament documents. You see, here's what historians do. When they don't have the originals, and we don't, of the New Testament, nor do we of any of these other documents I'm about to mention, when we don't have the originals, what scholars seek to do is find as many copies as they can to compare to each other to see what the originals would have been like. And then they try to find the earliest copies that they could have had in order to see what was closest to the original or how it might have changed through time. Let me give you some examples. Caesar, of political fame, wrote some works as well between 144 BC, in a time just shortly before Christ was said to have come to the earth. The earliest copy that we have is 1,000 years removed, 900 AD. And the number of copies that we have are 10 copies. So scholars compare those 10 copies from 1,000 years after Caesar claimed to have written, but they have no doubt that Caesar actually wrote those things and have no doubt about the accuracy of them because of the 10 they have to compare from 1,000 years before that. Okay, let's move to another example. Plato, of course, wrote before Caesar, 427 to 347 BC. The earliest copy that we have is still about 900 AD, about 12 or 1300 years removed, and there are about 7 copies, and people compare those and have no doubt that Plato actually wrote those when they claimed to have been written. And then there's Tacitus, who lived a little bit after Christ and wrote about 100 AD. He wrote some things about the Christian religion. The earliest copies that we have of his works are from 1,000 years later, 1100 AD, and we have about 20 of those copies to compare. Pliny, also a historian. Pliny the Younger wrote from about the same time period. There's only 750 years removed to the earliest copy for him, and there are about 7 copies of those. You get the picture, don't you? Suetonius wrote about the same time period, 75 to 160 AD. The earliest copy that we have is 950 AD, about 800 years removed, and we have 8 copies to compare. And nobody doubts that those works were written by the authors who claimed to write them. Now we have the New Testament. The New Testament claims to have been written about 50 to 100 AD. And the earliest copies that we have are only about 20 years after that. Not 1,000 years. The earliest copies are only about 120, 200, 325, 350. You have the John Rylands fragments, the Chester Beatty papyri from about 200, the Codex Sinaiticus from about 350, and the Codex Vaticanus from about 325 that has almost the entire Bible. So people can compare these manuscripts and see, and they're much earlier in time related to their writers than these other secular works were. And while these other secular works might have 7, 10, as many as 20 copies to compare, the documents of the New Testament have 5,000 Greek manuscripts to compare. And there are many translations in other languages, and on top of that, it has been said that the New Testament could be reproduced from the writings of the early church fathers. These were valid documents. The only reason that people shove off these documents as being invalid is because they don't want to believe the things that are in them. I would submit that for your consideration, please. The only reason that people don't want to believe these is because they have a bias against the supernatural. But these were valid historical documents from the time period. Now, if that's the case, do you realize what we have? We have from before 250 BC over 300 prophecies that directly relate to the person Jesus of Nazareth, who came and walked on the earth in Nazareth of Galilee and Jerusalem and all of that surrounding area, taught for 3 years, died, buried, and was resurrected. 300 and some prophecies that converge in this man. And these prophecies go from things like some very mundane things. I only call them mundane because they would be mundane in comparison to the miraculous. They're not mundane in that it was amazing that God could predict all of these details about the life and the death of Christ. What I mean by mundane is that they did not need miracles to fulfill them. Let me give you some examples. The lineage of Christ was always predicted. Way back in the book of Genesis, chapter 49, verse 10, it was predicted that he would come from the tribe of Judah, who came from the nation of Israel. And then in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 13 through 16, it was predicted that he would come from the kingly tribe for the kingly lineage, rather, of David. And he did. The genealogies in Matthew chapter 1 and in Luke chapter 3 record that, and these can be compared with all the genealogies that were verified in the Old Testament. Christ came through that lineage. That was predicted. His hometown was predicted. Micah chapter 5 verse 2 says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from of old, even from everlasting." That'd be Christ, wouldn't it? The eternal Christ came through the town of Bethlehem. It was predicted that Christ would have a forerunner who would be named Elijah, so to speak. Well, John the Baptist would come in the spirit and power of Elijah, Luke 1 verse 17. But 400 years before that, at the end of the Old Testament, these two verses appear. "Behold, I send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse." Malachi chapter 4 verses 5 and 6. So when Elijah died, people didn't think of him coming back really as Elijah, but they thought of someone coming in the spirit and power of Elijah, and that was Christ. Matthew chapter 17 verses 10 through 13 shows how the disciples of Jesus learned that as well. It was prophesied that there would be infanticide in an attempt to kill the Christ child. Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 15 speaks of the weeping and the mourning and the lamentation that took place in Ramah, the area where Christ was. And that was all a prophecy 500 or 600 years before, Herod the king sought to kill all the boys 2 years old and under so that he wouldn't have a challenge to his throne. You know the story from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. All those things were predicted. There's no mythological character that has all these things predicted in verified historical literature. But Christ had all these things predicted, and many others. Therefore, I don't think it should be all that surprising to us that we had some miraculous predictions fulfilled as well, such as that he would be born of a virgin, Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, or the very resurrection from the dead, that his soul would not be left in Sheol, nor would his flesh see corruption, Psalm 16, verse 10, which interestingly enough, the Apostle Peter quoted to a group of people only 7 weeks after Christ had been laid in his tomb, and proclaimed to them that Christ had been resurrected, and they couldn't argue against it. Matter of fact, 3,000 of them wanted to know what they could do to find forgiveness for the sin of calling for Christ's crucifixion those few weeks before that. They were told to repent and be baptized for the remission of their sins. Acts chapter 2, verse 38. Well, I believe that Jesus, who was crucified, just as the prophets prophesied, left the tomb unoccupied with angels in his stead. A second reason that I believe that Jesus came back from the dead was that there were witnesses. The second little verse of our song tells us, I believe he showed himself to witnesses, to those who would attest to his true presence in the midst of them, the many who beheld. Eyewitness evidence is of prime importance to detective work. It always has been. It always will be. Even in the age of DNA studies and CSI and all of those things, eyewitness evidence is of prime importance. The Gospels record for us, just 20 or 30 years after these events took place, that eyewitnesses saw the Christ. For example, there was Mary on the day of the crucifixion, and she told some of the disciples who went and looked at the empty tomb, and then 10 of them met, and Jesus appeared to them in John chapter 20. And then the next Lord's Day, I believe, or 8 days later as it says it in the Gospel accounts, he appeared to 11, including that famous doubting Thomas. He appeared to 2 of them on the road to Emmaus in Luke chapter 24. He appeared to 7 of them who had gone back to their careers of fishing in John chapter 21. He appeared to others, and they even appeared to over 500 brethren at once, Paul claims in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 6. Now what's interesting about that claim in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 6, is that Paul issues an implicit challenge to anybody who might doubt it. He says, he also appeared to over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. Now, a lot of historians tell us that the book of 1 Corinthians was written to the church at Corinth in the mid-50s AD. That would be 20 to 25 years after Christ died on the cross and was claimed to have been resurrected from the grave. You see what Paul's challenge is then? He appeared to over 500 people at once, and you can go ask them if you want to. That would be very similar to if something happened to me today and I wasn't around after this, and in 20 years somebody wrote a book about me telling all kind of lies and then said, go back and ask people that knew Andy. Well, that book would be exposed as a fraud and people would never believe it and the story wouldn't get off the ground. If this were a fraud, it wouldn't have got off the ground. But as it turns out, the religion of Christ has permeated history for the last 2,000 years with even the marker of time being centered around him. All because of all these evidences, including the eyewitness evidence. Some people say Christ's body was stolen. That doesn't explain different groups of people seeing him alive. Some people say Christ's body wasn't really there, people just hallucinated. Psychologists tell us that 500 people don't hallucinate with the same hallucination at the same time, nor do 2 or 10 or 11. Some people tell us Christ didn't really die on the cross. He just went into a very pathetic state of pain and suffering called a swoon and then pushed his way out of that tomb and came back to inspire a following. All right, do you ask me then to believe that Christ was scourged to within an inch of his life, hung on a cross for 6 hours, bleeding profusely, lifting himself up to be able to expand his lungs to breathe against the pressure of the nails that were tearing and ripping on his body, having a crown of thorns on his head, then put in an airless tomb for 72 hours or so, and then he had the strength to push away a 1.5 to 2 ton rock, bring himself out, show himself to his disciples, and inspire a following. That is what sounds to me like blind faith. I think it's much easier to believe the claims, because the claims add up. The third verse of our song, very briefly, says, I believed they preached him in Jerusalem as resurrected Son of Man, and enemies could not reprimand the truth of all their claims. The book of Acts was written within that generation, and people could have refuted it. But the book of Acts records how only 7 weeks after Christ, Peter was preaching that. And then the people believed, and they couldn't refute it. And then the fourth verse of our song says this, I believe disciples suffered sword and flame. They gladly bore the pain and shame to magnify the holy name of Christ their risen Lord. Yes, you see, the originators of this religion went to their deaths. 11 of the original 12 apostles died a martyr's death, holding to their belief that they saw Christ risen from the dead. Beginners of a religion don't do that. I realize there are some religions in our world today that cause people to die for their faith, but if you'll watch closely, I would suggest to you that it is not the leaders of that faith, but it's the young men who are being manipulated by the leaders of that faith. These men were the leaders, and they never hurt anybody, they never killed anybody, but they died themselves, proclaiming, I saw the Lord alive. And some of them, like Paul, gave up very luxurious lifestyles to live a life of suffering and then die a martyr's death holding to this. It all adds up to me. There's a philosophy called Occam's razor that says the easiest explanation is usually the right explanation. The easiest explanation for all of these facts, the prophecy, the witnesses, the early preaching, and the martyrdom of those early disciples, is to believe that Christ really was raised from the dead. And then his teaching is true. Someday I'll see him and be glorified with him when he transforms my lowly body to be like his. Philippians 3, verse 21. I thank you for listening today and hope these words might be of some encouragement and help. Go study it for yourself. Truth has nothing to fear. For now, would you please listen to the song again? Thank you.
People often ask me, why do you believe? Why do you believe and follow Jesus? That is when I tell them the reasons I can give for knowing that my Savior with God in heaven lives. I believe that Jesus, who was crucified, just as the prophets prophesied, he left the tomb unoccupied with angels in his stead. And I believe he showed himself to witnesses, to those who would attest to his true presence in the midst of them, the many who beheld. So when the people ask me, why do you believe? Why do you believe and follow Jesus? That is when I tell them the reasons I can give for knowing that my Savior with God in heaven lives. I believe they preached him in Jerusalem as resurrected Son of Man, and enemies could not reprimand the truth of all their claims. And I believe disciples suffered sword and flame. They gladly bore the pain and shame to magnify the holy name of Christ their risen Lord. This one great fact of history I'll cling to all my days, that one day I may see him when with him I am raised. That one day I may see him when with him I am raised.
Before we close our program today, we'd like to take a moment and review this roadmap to heaven with you, since the matter is so serious. There are many incorrect set of directions out there, and sadly so many people are following them. For example, some people have been given wrong turns. They believe things such as faith only, works only, or grace only. Or some attempt to change the order of the turns, being baptized before they even believe. Some people fail to realize what point they are on the map. Don't even open their Bibles yet, and they think they're saved already. As a person travels in a car or takes a hike, it has to follow the proper directions, so we must follow the proper directions to heaven. Let's take a look at the directions on our roadmap to heaven here. You have to look at these passages in your Bible for yourself. We'll just list the steps, the turns on the way. First is to believe or to have faith. And then number 2, to repent, to turn away from sin. Number 3 is to confess that Jesus is the Son of God. Number 4 is immersion, or to be baptized, which is a burial in water to have your sins washed away. And then you're added to the church by the Lord, not by a group of people, or not by giving some kind of testimonial experience or things like that. And then once you're added, you need to serve and worship the Lord faithfully all the days of your life. And the key word's faithfully. You don't waver. And that's very important. We need to keep in mind, too, that in Noah's day there was a big flood, and only people in the ark were saved from the flood. The same is true today. There is no salvation outside the Lord's church. Where are you on the roadmap to heaven? Thanks for watching our program. Please let us know if we can assist you with further information for your journey.